Good evening, Art History 2 classes. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Tonight, I am actually coming to you from Florence, Italy. This is my favorite city on the planet. I love the idea of being able to walk around one corner and there being a Michelangelo. His David is actually over this shoulder over here. You can walk around the corner and there might be a Donatello. That's just up. There's Roman ruins. There is wine country. We're in Tuscany. It's one of the most beautiful climates. It's a Mediterranean. People are friendly. The churches are absolutely spectacular and gorgeous. If I can ever afford to retire in Italy, I would absolutely choose to live somewhere in the Florentine region. My favorite hotel room in the world is also here. I stayed there once in a very off season. It was actually Leonardo da Vinci's bedroom, where you can actually go, and while they have a model of the bed that he stayed in, it's not the actual bed, but it is the actual room where Leonardo da Vinci actually used to live. So it's a spectacular, very cool place. Today we are covering the early Italian Renaissance art, and the real center, the epicenter of this is going to be Florence, Italy, where I currently am. The dates of early Italian Renaissance art, very similar to the dates of Northern Italian Renaissance art, or Northern Renaissance art. They're exactly the same, the 1350 to 1550. Now, where in the world is Italy? If you don't know, it is the boot shape right here off of Europe that kind of juts out almost like Florida into the water, into the Mediterranean Sea. So it very much has a Mediterranean climate. There's four dominant cities that are going to show up that we'll talk briefly about within the early Italian Renaissance and then later in the Renaissance. And those are going to be Venice, the city of the gondolas and of the canals, which is all the way up here in the northeastern section right here. Giotto's famous, the Giotto Arena Chapel that we talked about in Art History 1, which is going to be the basis for Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and the Apocryphal Tales, is right next door. That's actually in Padua or Padova. We're going to see Siena, which is a dominant power during this time period, and the rival here is Florence, and then Rome with the Vatican all the way down here. So those are going to be the dominant areas that we actually spend some time in. Why did Italian Renaissance art develop? Well, there's a number of different things that are going to happen. 1350 to 1550, if you look at the nation. One, we're going to have the rise of the banking industry. As before, remember, money lending, if you had more money than other people and you lended it out at interest, this was considered usury. It was considered one of the worst sins that you could do. Remember in the Arena Chapel we just talked about from our outside of Venice that Giotto did, that was his sons creating a chapel, dedicating it to the Virgin Mary, hoping that that would take their father out of hell, because he was a banker, an early banker, and that was only something that Jews were allowed to set up, and the Jews were hated. This was called usury. Today, it's the basis of basically modern-day finance. You can't afford something, you get it at an interest, at a loan that you pay back, so everyone gets money. You pay it back over time. It allows you to buy a house, potentially a college education with your student loans, a car. So it's really how we do the big purchases in life today. The patronage system is going to develop. Use money to buy power in arts and events. This is very similar to the way that if you go to a university or Miami-Dade College or any of the local libraries, there's probably a name that comes from a patron who paid for that particular building. The Kennedys, the Carnegies have largely used this to develop their clout. If you go back and you look at Carnegie, he was basically considered one of the robber barons. He monopolized a particular industry and ran other industries out of town. And as such, he had a very negative public image. So what did he do? He started donating money to universities like Carnegie Mellon University, and to libraries, and to Performing Arts Center, where people would go for entertainment and for fun, therefore raising the family status up that shows up. In the future, I guarantee you, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, with him being worth so much money, he will go through this process as well, because let's face it, if you look at the business practice of Amazon, particularly for people at the very bottom that are the runners, their business model treats them fairly poorly. And because they're going to get negative press, they're going to have to come up with a way, and maybe we have a Bezos theater in the future, or library, or the Bezos Miami-Dade College new entertainment center. So Bezos probably will go through this patronage system at some point in the future. It's something we still do today. There was more money spent on patronage of art than on all other expenditures during the Renaissance, including even for the poor. And the population was 50% poor during the Renaissance. The Muslims, right during this time period, are going to take over the spice trade. They're going to have dominated and taken over Jerusalem and the Silk Road routes that run over the spice trades. And that eventually is going to lead us to send Columbus in 1492, right basically smack dab in the middle, to the New World to actually set up the Columbian Exchange. He thinks he's found the Spice Islands, but brings back all these new foods, which for the rest of this class are going to transform Europe. Now, the Renaissance is fantastic if you are, and note up here, I want to talk about gender equality and reduced inequalities. In this class, we want to show you how the impact of what we've done from the past in humanism during the Renaissance and later on during the Baroque period has an impact on our modern day world. And so two of the things we've set up, and we saw this earlier in Art History 1 from the Greek and Roman cultures, that we did not have gender equality. We really weren't reducing inequalities. We had a large slave population, a smaller middle class population, and the small is still the high class or the ruling class that shows up, kind of like your Scrooge McDucks. In the modern day world, we actually want to reduce these inequalities, both in economic, gender, any inequalities. Race will be another inequality we want to reduce within the process. And so on certain slides throughout my course, we will have these things that are called United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and these are the symbols. And basically, they are targets that the United Nations has signed on, as well as the United States and almost every other nation on Earth, as targets to try to reduce inequalities, to reduce income disparity across the planet. And so when these kind of concepts show up, either as the areas where we really formulate this and how we got into the situation that we need to correct, or in ways that we're moving forward, you'll see these different logos that will stand up. And there are 16 different ones that show up that we'll be seeing throughout the course. So again, the Renaissance is fantastic if you are these things. If you're white or Caucasian, if you're wealthy, if you're male, if you're heterosexual, or at least can hide to heterosexuality, and if you're Christian. So here's the image of Jesus that we often come down, Christian with the flowing dreads and this wonderful, almost like a hippie wearing sandals during the time period. In reconstruction from the time period, this is actually the real face of Jesus. Jesus would have looked much more like a Middle Easterner, someone from the Arab world or from the different aspects of the Muslim world, than he ever would like a Christian white Norwegian. So the Renaissance is fantastic if you are white, wealthy, male, heterosexual, and Christian. Those 5 things. And the Renaissance is terrible for anyone else. If you're non-white, if you're black, we're going to start the slave trade during this time period, and the Roman Catholic Church is going to justify it. If you're poor, the vast majority of the population is poor. And so even though we don't necessarily have a huge amount of slavery in Europe by white people, we do have people that are indentured servants, and we have poor houses that go all the way into the 1800s for people, basically debtor's prison, for people who can't afford to pay their bills. We put them in prison and make them work basically for free. Homosexuals, we're so worried about them and God getting upset and causing a bubonic plague and bringing down our civilization that if you get accused, there's a likelihood that you won't even make it to court. You'll be beaten to death in the street, and your body will be left there as a warning for everyone else, but also for the bugs, the dogs, the crows to come and just pick your body apart. So the stench in these cities must have been atrocious. If you're female, it's great to be male. If you're female, you have problems. Generally, you are not your own person. You are the property of your father when you're born. And eventually you're going to get married off and you will become the property of your son of your husband later on. If your son dies, or sorry, if your husband dies and your son is old enough, he has the opportunity, not requirement, to take care of you, because in most parts of Italy and other parts of the Italian Renaissance, you can't own property. And so it's fairly often. If you're Jewish or atheist, you're hated. You're feared. You were considered a money lender, a usurer from before. And so even in Shakespeare's great plays, we have Shylock the Jew, who's basically a money lender. And they basically say that rather than collecting money like a bank normally would and say, all right, here's the money, they say, yeah, you can have your pound, a pound of flesh. But he was able to take the pound of flesh off of the body of the individual. But if he drew any blood or if the individual died, he would be killed. So these individuals really are very not well liked or tolerated. The Jews were only tolerated because they were lending money out, which the Christians, up until we developed the banking system, are not allowed to do. And that's going to be the Medici family in Florence. It's why Florence is about to take off. Europe has all sorts of problems this time period, which makes it ironic because we often think of the Renaissance. I mean, when you hear about the Renaissance, You think about this awesome, wonderful, amazing place with art and just beauty and everything. And that is true if you are a white, wealthy, heterosexual Christian male, and that's only 3% of the entire population. We have the bubonic plague that rolls in a couple times. We're going to have political upheavals and overthrows. We're going to have wars between city states. We're going to have battle between a religion and humanism that basically is going to bring a renaissance to an end at the end. We're going to develop the African slave trade for sugar, cocoa, tea. We're going to be looking at cotton, all sorts of different industries, tobacco. We're going to start exploring the new world and bringing back all those products. And of course, unfortunately, accidentally bringing over smallpox, which wipes out the population. We're going to destroy the Native and Latino American civilizations and bring over their gold. That will start during the Renaissance, but continue for another 300 years and fund many of the later art movements. Women are generally seen as property to bring families together, and there's 50% unemployment. This is a really rad. If I gave you these things and said, hey, tell me about the art during this time period, you are going to pick some medieval, Gothic, fearing art. And yet that's not what we see. We see an explosion in the arts because wealthy people use that art to soften their image and to make them look like awesome and great Christians. People such as the Rucellai family, or the Borgias, or the Medicis, probably the most famous, the godfathers of the Renaissance. Now, in this process, we've got to talk about the impact of Columbus, specifically as we think he sails across the sea in 1492. He's back in 1494 and then has a later trip. But the impact of Columbus and the pre-Columbian exchange cannot be overemphasized.
Many people in the United States and Latin America have grown up celebrating the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage. But was he an intrepid explorer who brought two worlds together, or a ruthless exploiter who brought colonialism and slavery? And did he even discover America at all? It's time to put Columbus on the stand in History versus Christopher Columbus. Order in the court. Wait, am I even supposed to be at work today? Yes, Your Honor. From 1792, Columbus Day was celebrated in many parts of the United States on October 12th, the actual anniversary date. But although it was declared an official holiday in 1934, individual states aren't required to observe it. Only 23 states close public services, and more states are moving away from it completely. What a pity. In the 70s, we even moved it to the second Monday in October so people could get a nice 3-day weekend. But I guess you folks just hate celebrations. What are we celebrating again? Come on, Your Honor. We all learned it in school. Christopher Columbus convinced the King of Spain to send him on a mission to find a better trade route to India. Not by going east over land,
that's because the Muslims took over the spice trades to the Middle East.
Everyone said it was crazy because they still thought the world was flat, but he knew better.
And that's actually crazy too. We didn't think the world was flat. Nobody thought that.
He found something better than India, a whole new continent. What rubbish. First of all, educated people knew the world was round since Aristotle. Secondly, Columbus didn't discover anything. There were already people living here for millennia, and he wasn't even the first European to visit. The Norse had settled Newfoundland almost 500 years before. You don't say. So how come we're not all wearing those cow helmets? Actually, they didn't really wear those either. Who cares what some Vikings did way back when? Those settlements didn't last, but Columbus's did. And the news he brought back to Europe spread far and wide, inspiring all the explorers and settlers who came after. Without him, none of us would be here today. And because of him, millions of Native Americans aren't here today. Do you know what Columbus did in the colonies he founded? He took the very first natives he met prisoner and wrote in his journal about how easily he could conquer and enslave all of them. Oh, come on. Everyone was fighting each other back then. Didn't the natives even tell Columbus about other tribes raiding and taking captives? Yes, but tribal warfare was sporadic and limited. It certainly didn't wipe out 90% of the population. Why is celebrating this Columbus so important to you anyway? Your Honor, Columbus's voyage was an inspiration to struggling people all across Europe, symbolizing freedom and new beginnings. And his discovery gave our grandparents and great-grandparents the chance to come here and build better lives for their children. Don't we deserve a hero to remind everyone that our country was built on the struggles of immigrants? And what about the struggles of Native Americans who were nearly wiped out and forced into reservations, and whose descendants still suffer from poverty and discrimination? How can you make a hero out of a man who caused so much suffering? That's history. You can't judge a guy in the 15th century by modern standards. People back then even thought spreading Christianity and civilization across the world was a moral duty. Actually, he was pretty bad even by old standards. While governing Hispaniola, he tortured and mutilated natives who didn't bring him enough gold, and sold girls as young as 9 into sexual slavery. And he was brutal even to the other colonists he ruled, to the point that he was removed from power and thrown in jail. When the missionary Bartolomé de las Casas visited the island, he wrote, from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? Well, I'm not sure I believe those numbers. Say, aren't there other ways the holiday is celebrated? In some Latin American countries, they celebrate the same date under different names, such as Dia de la Raza. In these places, it's more a celebration of the native and mixed cultures that survived through the colonial period. Some places in the US have also renamed the holiday as Native American Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, and changed the celebrations accordingly. So why not just change the name if it's such a problem? Because it's tradition. Ordinary people need their heroes and their founding myths. Can't we just keep celebrating the way we've been doing for a century without having to delve into all this serious research? It's not like anyone is actually celebrating genocide. Traditions change, and the way we choose to keep them alive says a lot about our values. Well, it looks like giving tired judges a day off isn't one of those values anyway. Traditions and holidays are important to all cultures, but a hero in one era may become a villain in the next, as our historical knowledge expands and our values evolve. And deciding what these traditions should mean today is a major part of putting history on trial.
And so one of the things we have to talk about is really what happened then, not specifically within Columbus, but when we actually think about what's called the Columbian Exchange. You've probably never really been through the numbers before. And so I'm going to give you some numbers that I absolutely want you to write down that are staggering when we actually look at the numbers overall. And that is, once in 1492, we start establishing the slave trade. And Columbus, be very honest, brought over slaves himself and brought back some slaves that were indigenous population. So the slave trade really does begin with him. It really doesn't get full-fledged until the very end of the Renaissance, and really carries over all the way from 1500 to about 1810, with the height really coming in between about 1700 to about 1800. And so what happens is we often are given a number that 6.5 million slaves traveled from Africa, were captured, not traveled from, were taken forcefully from Africa into the New World and then distributed throughout. Well, that is a crappy number, because 6.5 million people only tells us the number of individuals that were taken out that survived. The death rate on these slave trade missions could be as much as 30 to 40%. And so the actual number of slaves to begin with that were taken out of Africa, that number is 12 million. Now, that's 12 million people basically with free labor once they make it to the New World, that's whose ancestors are also slaves. And that's why the 12 million is a terrible, terrible, terrible number. The 12 million is the number taken out of Africa. However, it does not account for the children of those 12 million slaves who were slaves, and their children's children, and their great-grandchildren. And so when we actually add the numbers up for slavery, the numbers become staggering. Now, from Europe, we're sending over things such as the horse, the sheep, pigs, cattle, a lot of animals, also carrots, apples. From North America then coming over, we're going to get things like the potato. We're going to get things like corn. We're going to get pumpkin. We're going to get squash. We're going to get pineapple. We're going to get chocolate, tobacco, and sugar to sweeten our foods. There's so much sweetness that comes back and so much heat from the peppers and things that are coming over. It changes the diet of North America. So we really do rely on the slave trade once we get it going to feed ourselves in the way that we want. Now, this is what a slave ship would have looked like. Note, These individuals, and this is called a slave pack. So this is an actual slave pack sheet on how you should pack your slaves so they have enough room to sleep. That's 18 inches. You basically get your shoulder width next to you. Now, when you need to pee or poop, you don't knock and say, hey, Mr. Slave owner, I need to pee or poop. You defecate all over yourself. You pee, so you're lying in it. Maybe once a week, you actually get pulled up for some fresh air to clean off the area so people don't get sick and die. Of course, because lying in your own feces, there's all sorts of problems. If you die, people might not know it, and you'll be sitting there rotting next to the individual and decomposing for anywhere for a couple of weeks. Or I'm sorry, for about a week. It could be a couple of days, and it's stinking within the process with all the effluents and fluid. If you get sick, you're so close and coughing, there's no way, you're chained up. And unfortunately, the women that were taken were often raped numerous times within the process. Some slaves didn't get enough exercise that they actually had to be taught how to relearn how to walk when they made it to the new world because their legs and their muscles had atrophied. So we were talking about one of the most disgusting, vile things in human history. And part of that was to change the diet. Where chocolate grows, people can't afford to eat it. So chocolate grows in these red areas, and about 92% of the native population died. That's largely, most of them died not from war, but from the unintentional consequences of Columbus and other Europeans coming over. They brought a disease called smallpox, which wiped them out because they had no natural immunity to smallpox. Kind of like when Corona hit here in the United States and around the world. No one had ever had a natural immunity for Corona. So everyone was potentially at risk, at least to get sick and to die if you had an immunocompromised. That's what takes place here. But it's so much more deadly that 92% of the native population die in a better part of about 150 years. So the population plummets to just a couple million people. So by the time that we start colonizing in the United States of America and our colonies, the population of the native population is dwindled. So it's much easier for us to take over with very limited numbers. So chocolate is one of the main reasons why, because we love the taste of chocolate. So here's actually the history of chocolate and the sweetness that helps fund the slave trade that's going to impact
If you can't imagine
our class from here on out.
Chocolate, you're lucky you weren't born before the 16th century. Until then, chocolate only existed in Mesoamerica, in a form quite different from what we know. As far back as 1900 BCE, the people of that region had learned to prepare the beans of the native cacao tree. The earliest records tell us the beans were ground and mixed with cornmeal and chili peppers to create a drink, not a relaxing cup of hot cocoa, but a bitter, invigorating concoction, frothing with foam. And if you thought we make a big deal about chocolate today, the Mesoamericans had us beat. They believed that cacao was a heavenly food gifted to humans by a feathered serpent god, known to the Maya as Kukulkan, and to the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl. Aztecs used cacao beans as currency and drank chocolate at royal feasts, gave it to soldiers as a reward for success in battle, and used it in rituals. The first transatlantic chocolate encounter occurred in 1519, when Hernán Cortés visited the court of Montezuma at Tenochtitlan. As recorded by Cortés' lieutenant, the king had 50 jugs of the drink brought out and poured into golden cups. When the colonists returned with shipments of the strange new bean, missionaries' salacious accounts of native customs gave it a reputation as an aphrodisiac. At first, its bitter taste made it suitable as a medicine for ailments like upset stomachs. But sweetening it with honey, sugar, or vanilla quickly made chocolate a popular delicacy in the Spanish court. And soon, no aristocratic home was complete without dedicated chocolateWare. The fashionable drink was difficult and time-consuming to produce on a large scale. That involved using plantations and imported slave labor in the Caribbean and on islands off the coast of Africa. The world of chocolate would change forever in 1828 with the introduction of the cocoa press by Conrad van Houten of Amsterdam. Van Houten's invention could separate the cocoa's natural fat, or cocoa butter. This left a powder that could be mixed into a drinkable solution or recombined with the cocoa butter to create the solid chocolate we know today. Not long after, a Swiss chocolatier named Daniel Peter added powdered milk to the mix, thus inventing milk chocolate. By the 20th century, chocolate was no longer an elite luxury, but had become a treat for the public. Meeting the massive demand required more cultivation of cocoa, which can only grow near the equator. Now, instead of African slaves being shipped to South American cocoa plantations, cocoa production itself would shift to West Africa, with Côte d'Ivoire providing 2/5 of the world's cocoa as of 2015. Yet, along with the growth of the industry, there have been horrific abuses of human rights. Many of the plantations throughout West Africa, which supply Western companies, use slave and child labor, with an estimation of more than 2 million children affected. This is a complex problem that persists despite efforts from major chocolate companies to partner with African nations to reduce child and indentured labor practices. Today, chocolate has established itself in the rituals of our modern culture due to its colonial association with native cultures. Combined with the power of advertising, chocolate retains an aura of something sensual, decadent, and forbidden. Yet knowing more about its fascinating and often cruel history, as well as its production today, tells us where these associations originate and what they hide. So as you unwrap your next bar of chocolate, take a moment to consider that not everything about chocolate is sweet.
And one of the things that shows up is that still the vast majority of the chocolate that we grow today is actually still grown by slaves in West Africa. And so the vast majority of the chocolate in the world comes from West Africa, most of it actually from Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. And what the chocolate manufacturers are asking you to do is that, would you be willing to pay 2 to 3 times the price of chocolate if it did involve slaves or child labor? And so chocolate that generally is safe carries a fair trade logo that shows up. If you don't have chocolate that's fair trade in your local grocery store, you can't ask them to carry fair trade chocolate. You can inform your friends of chocolate production issues. The chocolate industry has done a fantastic job hiding this. So I don't necessarily agree with the TEDx talk here that the chocolate manufacturers are working collaboratively. A few of them are, like Dove Chocolate. Godiva Chocolate is trying to do the right thing. But very few chocolatiers, like Hershey's is a terrible chocolatier in terms of being able to do that. They are not really working to try to get high quality chocolate that is slave free and also friendly for the environment. Hershey's and Nestle's are both terrible within it. You could talk, write your email, your national political leaders. You could pass out only fair trade chocolate at Halloween, Christmas, and Easter. Now, that not everyone can do that because it's 2 to 3 times, but you could avoid chocolate and give out another sugar sweet that's not nearly as bad for the environment or for the slave populations. You put your opinions out there on YouTube, invest in only socially responsible mutual funds. I will tell you that this is what my wife and I do. My wife and I actually only invest in socially responsible mutual funds so that we can limit the harm that we're doing while our money is growing for our investments in retirement in the future. And there are mutual funds out there that specifically will invest this in for you. So like they don't invest in hydrocarbons. And so sometimes one of the strange things, and my father-in-law will also often make fun of us and critique us in the way that we are actually trying to grow wealth within this process by putting our money into socially responsible mutual funds. They're more expensive. Why? They pay their workers, so they don't use slaves. But at the same time, then, yes, it might take us an extra 5 to 10 years to retire, but at the same time, we're actually hopefully bettering the world. And so even though we make less of a profit each particular year. The thing that I want to show you that I find shocking still today is that we have more slaves today in the history of the world than we've ever had at one time ever. So there are currently estimated to be 27 million slaves in the world today, the most ever. And they basically dominate 3 industries. If you don't know, they are the chocolate industry, the diamond industry, and coltan. So if you have a cell phone right in front of you or in your hand, the semiconductor most likely is made of coltan, a mineral that you only find in slave growing and slave areas. And so the harvesting of that coltan has been used to fund what we call the African World War. Now, if you've never heard of the African World War, it's pretty remarkable. because that means that the cell phone companies and the semiconductor companies have done fantastically well educating you or uneducating you about this, because we are looking at, in the last 20 years, 8 different African nations, about 4 million deaths, and hundreds of thousands of rapes, all taking place in Central Africa. But as long as Coltan, which funds the war, comes out, shh, no one says anything. So the chocolate scorecard over here, this is as of last year. So Alter Ego Echo gets an A, Divine, Endangered Species, Equal Exchange, Shaman, Theo Chocolate. Now these are all more expensive. Here's their labor certification. You'll note Nestle, Lindt, Hershey's, Godiva all the way at the end. Now I said Godiva's doing better. Godiva can't find enough chocolate that's not some slave chocolate and verified. So they've actually really moved up. They're more in the C category, and they're actively working with individuals to try to promote those. And so Godiva is actually trying to do their part. Mars, Nestle, Hershey, they kind of hide and said, we'll get the non-fair trade chocolate when everyone else pushes it up, meaning they're not putting any of their money or their profits into developing that industry. So if you're buying from those particular chocolate companies, you're buying from people who literally have not done that much on slave chocolate or to help child farmers in Africa. Now, as I mentioned, the Renaissance is awesome if you are those 4 things or those 5 things: white, heterosexual, male, Christian, and wealthy. And so these are what your churches in the areas where we were. Now, we can't think like France and England and Germany of Italy being a country. They are individual city-states that keep incorporating large urban populations that are constantly at war with one another. The dominant 4, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was Florence, Venice, Siena, and Rome. And if you've ever heard of Sienna brown or burnt sienna, that's the color of the dirt in Siena. So here it is, an actual color hue for Siena. Now, I would like to show you a fairly long video. Now, if you do not want to watch the video now, the video is about 20 minutes. But what it does is it establishes how patronage, godfathers, and the rebirth of classical architecture through Brunelleschi and the creation of Il Duomo. You're more than welcome to watch all of it, or you can skip ahead if you think you know this material pretty well, about 20 minutes in advance, and we'll continue the lecture on from there. Skip through until we get back to the dome part again. So we don't need to talk about the wealth. We actually just want to go to the area. There we go, where we have the building again. Spent 20 minutes actually watching this video on one of the most important artworks of the early Italian Renaissance and arguably of the Renaissance. That idea that mankind can accomplish the unaccomplishable. This is going to change the definition of human or humanism then in the Renaissance versus the Northern Renaissance. Remember, in Northern Renaissance, we have this estimation where God's highest creation. We're looking at the humanity in each one of us. We're looking at how we should interact. That is all still true in Italy, but they're going to add on the element of one-upsmanship. The idea that if Brunelleschi did this, I need, if I'm a great artist, to do something better. Leonardo wants to be better than Brunelleschi. Donatello wants to be better than Brunelleschi. Michelangelo wants to be better than Da Vinci. Raphael wants to be better than Michelangelo. This is one of the major concepts that's going to drive the artwork in future, and the scientists that are working for the Medici in Florence on and on and on. Just like, look what Brunelleschi did. He basically refounds and rethinks the way we do humanism. And so that's going to move us forward. So we can't overestimate what is developed here, basically on the Il Duomo of the Florentine Cathedral by Filippo Brunelleschi, modeled after the Pantheon and reinventing classical architecture. He's going to develop one-point perspective out of this. He's going to change the definition of humanism. He's going to invent new engineering techniques that allow other churches to be built in the same model. He's going to reinvent the dome along with classical architecture in a new way, so you no longer need wood scaffolding. And his herringbone design, that kind of lacquer that what you see over here, so it's not all straight, is just much more powerful. So even in an area that is prone to potentially volcanoes or volcanic activity that can cause earthquakes, the better part of almost 600 years later now, this dome is still one of the largest domes in the entire world. It's a remarkable accomplishment. And so you see the original drawings of the dome, the interior. It's a spectacular space. So it was built during the politics about this, built during Cosimo de' Medici's life. he was kicked out of office. And when he was, as the video talked about, Brunelleschi was arrested and put in the tower, and he was worried he was going to be thrown out. But the economy collapsed without the Medici patronage going in. So a year later, they invited Medici back to be the ruler. And this led the idea of the birth of political science, which we saw in an earlier video when we were looking at Erasmus's idea. So the Prince by Machiavelli basically says that this is the political science, or the birth of political science in the South, that individuals should imitate the behavior of great men. And this basically was an homage that was made for the Medici as almost a job application, saying, hey, look, here's how I will advise you to make sure that you stay in power so you can do good. So not just that you'll do good so people keep in power, it was more about keeping power. He's got a dedication to the art of war, an understanding that apparent cruelties and vice may be essential to maintaining stability and power, because it is better to be feared than to be loved, because generally you can't be both. And here are some of his most famous quotes then. The offenses one does to a man should be such that one does not fear revenge for it. So you can offend a man as long as they're not going to, so you can take $1, but you can't take his house. The end justifies the means. If the ends are good for the vast majority of people, it's going to justify the means of it. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. And politics have no relation to morals. We often talk about the amoral or immorality of our politicians today, and Machiavelli would say, yes, that's exactly right. There should be an immoral politician, because to be moral and politician means to be thrown out of office and not be able to do anything good in the future. And so the Renaissance humanism that's going to develop, humanity can achieve anything it can outdo previous generations, the one-upsmanship concept. The human brain is awesome, functions 24 hours a day, from the day you were born, and only stops when you take an exam or fall in love. The interior of the dome, gorgeous, was painted by Vasari. He basically had to have a swing hanging off as he's painting it. So he's 300 feet in the air, basically on the swing set, hanging down from the rafters. And here he is actually showing some of the demons and the devils and the torments that's taking place, because it is a last judgment with Christ in majesty. This is a 200-foot tall or 180-foot tall painting, and about 180 feet with thousands of figures. Brunelleschi is also a sculptor, and so his Sacrifice of Isaac, which you read about. Oh, I should mention, the Italian Renaissance art aesthetics, no, they're the exact same thing as the Northern Renaissance art aesthetics. The only thing that's different is that they're going to try to create a 3D world. But no, from Erasmus, we're still going to have empiricism, we're still going to have humanism, we're going to have that love of God, we're going to have middle-class patronage, greetings, we're going to have way more classicism, because these are their ancestors. They live in the Roman province where the Roman world dominated, no matter what of this 4 city-states that dominates the world look like. Everything's going to be symbolic, but they're going to create a 3D world. They want you to see in 3-dimensional space, so they're about to invent one-point perspective. Thank you again, Felipe Brunelleschi. So here's the competition between Ghiberti, who is Donatello's teacher, and Brunelleschi. They both put in this to see which one is actually better, and the Baptistry Doors competition ends up as a tie with these two, because they express very different things. So in class, we'll talk about how the variations change between showing 3-dimensional depth, specifically, versus showing an emotional expression in each, and which one you believe is better, because it was a tie. Now, Ghiberti, who is Donatello's teacher, basically treats Donatello and teaches him the same way that all artists were taught during the time period, through the guild system. So artistic training in Renaissance Italy began. Artists began as 7 to 15-year-old children. The fathers would negotiate with the master artist, and they would pay for the early part of the education. The guild supervised the rigorous training, ensure only the best became artists and became masters. So if you were an artist in Renaissance Italy, you were good, because your professional individuals around you said you were good enough. The most famous thing you could do, and we still have this today, we tell you to imitate the copy of the work of the masters. Try to emulate them. Once you can emulate them, you're probably ready to do your own artwork. So emulation, use previous ideas to create their own improvements or innovations. That was the goal of a master. You imitate the style of your master, and then you make emulations upon that critique as they show up. The baptistry doors where this competition between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi is right here. And today you'll see, you can go and actually see. And Brunelleschi created a 1-point perspective where you could actually see through a small little area, get a reflection. So the line would come here, get a reflection through. And so you could actually make a copy of that particular image. So that's how he got to be so realistic and figure out how 1-point perspective works. It's from that machine. Later on, Leonardo da Vinci is going to use it as well. And then Ghiberti's student, the one we've got to talk about, is Donatello, one of our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, actually the first TMNT that we actually see in this class. He lived approximately from 1386 to 1466. And you can see his artworks here. For the time period, think about, we are just coming out of the medieval period. Think about how awkward things were. He's basically reinventing the classical sculpture. That's one of the things that shows up, and trying to reinvent new ways from the classical world. And so if you look at the classical sculpture that is now his model rather than Gothic, he's gotten much, much closer. It still doesn't have the calm expression. And this particular artwork was renowned for the rebirth of Contrabbasto, of large standing bronze sculptures, of the classical beauty and poses, which really is borrowed from Spearbearer. But note, this is a controversial image because it potentially has this homoerotic feather. I don't know if you can see it here, but see this line? Here you can see it over here. It goes all the way up, basically in the crevice of David's butt cheek here. And so it is a really controversial. There's this homoerotic element. It was originally meant to be outside, right? Actually outside where I am right here, where Michelangelo's David is. But they said it was too homoerotic and they put it inside to make sure that no one else saw it except the Medici. Now, they could have had the Medici destroy it, but again, Medici, remember, are so powerful in this time period that they do get some clout and some breaks that other people just don't get. And so now the problem, of course, is not only the nudity, because if you do not know the story of David and Goliath, David is Christ's great, 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 great grandfather. And so on some level, Christ comes from the line of David, which poses all sorts of problems if we're referring to homoeroticism here. And they did this because the story, of course, between David fighting Goliath is the little guy fighting the big guy and winning. That's what happens between Florence and Siena. Florence is the little city. Now, they have the Medici that's funding everything, and so they have the most powerful, most wealthy individual in the world. But Siena is the dominant superpower. Florence has a population somewhere around 70,000. Siena is about 200,000. And Siena, because of the wealth and the resplendence, and the Medici Bank keeps wanting to take over Florence. They keep attacking. They're about 60 kilometers, 40 miles apart. So they keep attacking throughout the Renaissance. But Florentines keep winning. One time it's because of the weaponry that Leonardo da Vinci invents. Another time, it's very hard to attack on an offensive. Another one, they run out of food. So there's a number of different times when Siena attacks Florence, and they just lose the battle. Each time then, Florence gets more empowered, more powerful, more wealthy with the Medici Bank, and they invest that in decorating their city and their arts, showing that the little guy can outdo the big guy. Why? Because God was helping Florence. When we look at Donatello, here's one of the more famous Donatello. This is called the Feast of Herod. And the reason why this is famous is that this is a small bronze plate. And the bronze plate, the three-dimensionality, which the Italian Renaissance is trying to do, is spectacular. Now, the Feast of Herod, if you don't know, here's the story. Salome has a morbid request to be rewarded the head of John the Baptist on a platter if she's willing to do Salome's dance, from Mark chapter 6, verses 21 through 28. Note that each person reacts in a personal way to the head presentation, from disgust to surprise to unbelievable, with people in the background playing the music and not really sure what's even happening. And so, but note, the action is focused on this diagonal composition, and note how detailed it is up here, and it disappears in this kind of 1-point perspective as you move back. That had never been seen before, and really it basically is using the machine that Brunelleschi invented that allows you to see 1-point perspective. Later on, he's going to do the Mary Magdalene from 1453, a very expressive style. Again, another controversial figure, very similar to his image of Dave with the homoerotic pose, because look at Mary Magdalene. Normally, she's depicted as this beautiful woman. Even after 30 years in a cave, relying only on God's love to feed her. Here he shows her as a ragged, wretched individual, probably naturalistically how she really would have looked coming out of the cave. Ragged, wretched, not shaved. She probably would have smelled. It's a total rejection of classical ideas and was very controversial during the Renaissance. But remember, artists are trying to do one-upsmanship, invent new things, which means that creativity gets to explode. Now, one of his rivals during the time period, though not a sculptor, is the painter Masaccio. Masaccio, the name actually means big, messy Tom. And note, he does the Trinity and the tribute money, both of which you read about. And each deals, and the one we'll talk about specifically, I'll let you come back and look at those other ones if you want to. But what Renaissance aesthetics do you see in the Trinity by Masaccio? And this is by Big Messy Tom from 1427 to 1428. What elements of empiricism, that scientific study of the world, of humanism, of middle-class patronage, of everything being symbolic, of creating a three-dimensional world where this shines, classicism, and search for classical perfection in Christianity, what do you see in this picture? And that really is something that we will be talking about in class. You can find almost all of them if you look. It is actually more difficult to find middle-class patronage here because these are actually the donors, again, who show up in the painting and rarely and weirdly look at one another versus at the Jesus message that shows up here, which is very odd. So it's generally not middle-class patronage, even though all of us get to see it because it's placed into our church. So you'll note the invention trying to play around with making a three-dimensional space comes out of Brunelleschi's one-point perspective. So here we actually see the Trinity, God, the Son, the Holy Father with the dove above. Mary represents the crucifixion herself, or presents the crucifixion, looking out at you and making that hand gesture. St. John looks up kind of almost in torment, and the patrons look at each other, and they wear the red Florentine council robes, particularly the male here that we saw with Leonardo, or that we saw in Cosimo de' Medici in the video. So he's clearly one of the council fathers, a very wealthy, important man. The vanishing point, if you look at this, vanishing point, where's it coming at? It's going to be at the base of the cross rather than at the head of the cross, going all the way down, reminding viewers of the Trinity's place above worldly affairs. So your head would be here. This is about 6 feet in the air. So when you would walk into the church, you would be forced to look up, almost like you're looking up into the heavens because you're at eye level. The tomb appears to project forward. It does not. It's a master class in one-point perspective, but it really does, with the shading, look like it's coming out at you till you realize that this is a flat wall. And so here, the quote that actually is on this right here says, "I once was what now you are, and what I am you shall be." A reminder that death comes to all of us, the wealthy, the saints, and even Jesus himself. And resurrection because of Jesus' sacrifice. The way that we are going to be able to do this is because of Brunelleschi's one-point perspective. And later on, we have something called the Dürer grid, which is exactly this. It's basically a screen, so you can actually put everything in proportion. So if you want to put another figure, you put a figure behind here, and you would have an exact proportional scale because the squares are identical within the process. It is how your eyes function, these almost little gridlock-like block-like structures. We do not know whether Masaccio actually did the exact same thing with his one-point perspective, but we do know this is something credited to Dürer, who is a later artist. Now, as we look at our great artists, we now have looked at Brunelleschi and Masaccio. The next one up for us that you did some reading and a video watching about is the very famous and most beautiful, what we call Neoplatonic artist of Sandro Botticelli. And he has a very unfortunate name for the modern day world. Botticelli actually translate over as little fat one. These individuals, we generally don't always know their first and last names. They weren't that important. We have a reference to them. They generally had nicknames. Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci's not his last name. Leonardo means from the town of Vinci. So, and he was a bastard child because his father did not give him his name. That's why we call it Leonardo da Vinci. Sandro Botticelli just means Sandro of the little fat one because of a characteristic shape of his body. And he was quite a trickster that showed up. He creates some of the most beautiful images. And what he does is he combines Christianity with Platonic forms. And what we mean by Platonic forms are ideal forms from the past. So he's called a Neoplatonist or a Neoplatonic. He's kind of combining the elements, and so of the ancient world with the modern day world. So when he shows a beautiful image of the Virgin Mary, it might also be an image of Aphrodite or of the Roman god Venus at the same time, because they represent the same thing: absolute marital love and bliss and harmony and purity and goodness. And so he's combining those elements together because there's classical world and Christian world, and that's exactly what the Renaissance is doing. It's reinventing the classical world so we can put it in the defense and use it to show the idealized humanist world of the Christian world today. And so the art patron Rucellai often says of art, and again, patronage, raising up your personal status. This is why he buys into art and buys artists and supports artists, because they serve the glory of God, the honor of the city, and the commemoration of myself. So it really is, and they recognize it as self-aggrandizement. It's a great way of marketing, the same way we might buy a Super Bowl ad. So everyone around sees it and says, wow, that person or that product is really awesome. This, while being one of the most beautiful paintings on earth, has a major problem. And that is the background story behind this is horrific. And ladies, hold on to your seat because it's going to involve you. There is, and I'll go to the next slide so we can look at all the little details. I'll give you first off, it is very much an empirical masterpiece. When we talk about empiricism in the Renaissance, this is one of the artworks that I showed you from the very get-go. There are 40 different named fruits and flowers that are species of flowers that are blossoming here in La Primavera, translate as spring. Everything's coming in. Women, we had not invented deodorant, used to take these flowers and these beautiful kind of fruits, used to hide them on their bodies almost as deodorant. And on their wedding night, a man, a husband, would actually unwrap and find these little gifts all over different parts of her erotic sensuality, whether it's butt, vagina, breasts, under the armpits. And they would be these very sensual moments of things that have basically been pressed up or into different parts of the female body to make her smell wonderful on her wedding night. And for wealthy people, every day of the year could be that because they could afford these fresh cut flowers. The story that goes here that's terrifying is the following. This particular artwork, let me go back one. This particular artwork was given as a wedding gift to commemorate the marriage of Medici Nephew Leonardo with Semiradere after Leonardo raped Semiradere. It was given as a gift. The best thing that she could do, because she was raped by a Medici, is actually, ironically, marry the Medici. There's no charges in general you're going to be able to press. Even today, only 2% of rape cases get charged and 1% get convictions. And so we're hundreds of years after when we value the female body, not necessarily equally, as we'll see. Women don't make fair pay, but we're getting closer and closer to this. And so La Primavera, then, the story goes, right here we have the wind god Zephyr. The wind god Zephyr is after this beautiful woman named Chloris. Chloris is a wood nymph, and he constantly is after her. And normally by the time he gets there, she transforms herself into a tree because he's a wood nymph. And of course, he's not going to rape a tree. He wants the female beauty that's turning him on so much. Well, one day he sneaks up on her and he grabs her before she has a chance to turn into a tree, and he rapes her. And note, the rape serves her well. She buds, and she's got flowers growing out of her mouth, and she basically buds into Flora. The wood that's been impregnated with male perfect seed now becomes the goddess Flora of a flowering like she's pregnant. This is the image then, and a portrait, we believe, of Semiradere, who actually is going to be the new woman. Note how happy and content she is that she's actually had sex, even forcibly, by the Medici who was on top of her, who is actually the Zephyr. So it's a pretty intense thing. Now, here's the Virgin Mary, or Venus, or both, again, Neoplatonic thought, basically raising her hand, blessing the marriage, saying, yes, this marriage is good, you can go ahead. Over here, we're going to have Leonardo later on, looking away, and note, he's dispelling little myths, or he's dispelling little clouds that are coming across. When what should he be doing? Well, if he's a heterosexual 20-year-old male, you should probably be looking at these naked women, or very naked. The three graces are considered the most beautiful women. You know, they're about grace and beauty and art, and he's not looking at them at all, and we'll have a lot of indications later on. There's a bunch of different indications that different household members of the Medici are gay. Now, remember, we're not going to announce this in public because the Medici are walking around and they are the city founders, they're authorities, they've got their own guards. but there are some hints and indications. Think about the homoerotic artwork coming out of Donatello earlier with that little feather going all the way up into David, who was one of Christ's ancestors' crotch. We're going to see a number of these references throughout the Renaissance. People don't bring up charges because if they do, they end up dead. The Medici might end up dead, but you will probably end up dead somewhere in a ditch as well, right? Because the Medici control the police force. In fact, they are the police force. And that's this terrible thing. The plot gets worse. This was a wedding gift. And so on their wedding night, even though they had already had sex, even though it was rape, this is the gift that is actually hanging on Samarade's bedroom wall for him and Leonardo to come in, basically saying, yeah, the rape was unintentional or was not controllable, but it's good now because you're married. And so it basically reinforces that women are property passed from father to husband. Men marry at the age of 35 because they have to pay to get into a guild, which may be $15,000 or more. And women are about 16-year-olds. Rape in the Renaissance, women raped if they lose a battle. It's something just very common. Thousands, actually millions of women have been raped throughout history because basically when you win a war, part of it is you win another man's women. You win their children. You can kill them. And so it's a terrible time. If raped, a woman's options are basically this. The best option is to marry the rapist, as you can see down here. You can arrange an alternative marriage. This is hard unless you are going to go down. If you're upper class, maybe you'll marry someone from the middle class. You could join a nunnery, or if no one else can support you, potentially you become a prostitute if you can't find anyone else to marry you. Remember, because marry the rapist is the best option, but the rapist may not want to marry you. As awful as it sounds, that is a hard thing to muster. How humanist do they go within the process? Well, we do have an individual here, one of the great monks who kind of goes a little off the rail during this time period, called Savonarola. And he's actually really good friends with Michelangelo later on. He says, I cannot, this is a quote from Savonarola, I cannot endure the evil doing of the heedless people of Italy. I must fight with all my strength to keep all the devil at bay. Because he believes all of this humanist art about love and frolicking and Neoplatonic thought and humanism and that we're God's highest creation, but somehow some of us are better than others. He thinks this is all evil. And so he organizes these things called Bonfire of the Vanities. They are fire where they burn humanist artworks like Botticelli and Galileo, and a number of Botticellis are actually burnt. In fact, Botticelli falls under the spell of Savonarola and actually burns a fair amount of his own artworks. So in this case, he has a whole roving gang. Basically, he's a medieval monk. He's trying to make sure, he's living during the Renaissance, but medieval mind to mind about fearing God. And so he wants to make sure that his society, and God knows he's doing everything he can to stamp out humanism. And so sexual deviants, particularly homosexuals, would be beaten. He banned makeup and jewelry and would beat or spit on women who wore it to try to make them look ugly. And his law was enforced by gangs of teenagers that roved around and basically beat the crap out of people. And so later on, Botticelli's going to fall under the spell, burn some of his own works in honor of Savonarola. Eventually, he's going to be excommunicated and put to death by fire. So now we have the birth of Venus, another one of those Neoplatonic thought, where we basically have the Virgin Mary, basically also shown as the Venus, as she emerges on a shell just from the idea of the waters as this absolute perfection that's coming up, about to get clothed so she can live more in the human world than in the God world. With, of course, Zephyr and Chloris, the wind god, and that rape victim Samarate basically blowing them on. Another one of the most beautiful images, but it's a little disturbing when you see the other references around it with flowers blowing everywhere. So we have talked about four main artworks, or four main artists. We've hit up Masaccio. We've talked about Botticelli. We've talked about Brunelleschi, and we've talked about Donatello. Here's the challenge. When the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle designers were making the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they needed to know which artist would be the best representation to be the fourth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Leonardo and Michelangelo are solid. Raphael is pretty solid later on of the later generation. Now we need to come up with our early Italian Renaissance Ninja Turtle. And the question for you is, I want you to now evaluate what these particular artists did and determine who is the best representation. Not because a child can say their name, a child can be taught to say any name. Don't believe me? Look at some of the strange names that Pokemon have, and any child can be taught to say those. And so, which one of these should be? Should it still be Donatello now that you've seen everything you do? So I'd like you to make a list of what Donatello, Masaccio, Botticelli, Masaccio, and Brunelleschi did, and determine which one is the true Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Go. You can pause here, and I will go on in just a minute. After you're able to pause, you can come up with your own answer. Now, clearly, I'm not going to give you the answer because that's something I want you to work out. But here's some of the forms that show up. Brunelleschi going to invent one-point perspective, going to redefine humanism as one-upsmanship, going to come up with new engineering techniques, going to reinvent classical architecture, particularly create a new way to look at the dome. For Botticelli, we have the Neoplatonic thought, which is basically combining classics and Christianity and really promoting the notion of beauty. For Donatello, we have all the new reinventions in specifically challenging the church with a little bit of homoerotic art, even though it was kind of banned and they were forced to hide it. He's got the reinvention, but not the invention, but the of sculpture and of a large scale equestrian figures. And then, of course, for Masaccio, it's the first time we ever do one-point perspective in painting, and he really does knock it out of the park and kind of fix it in a two-dimensional format for everyone else. Then he's also going to create the idea of the outside light source for an artwork as it's coming in three-dimensional bodies that he's going to carry on the tradition coming out of Giotto. And out of these, then, who do you think is the most important? Now, as we get close to wrapping up on the early Renaissance, let's talk about why the early Renaissance is so amazing. And part of it is the following. If you look at that top quote up here, the top idea, there are only 3 times in human history when the geniuses of any age congregated in the same city at the same time. One of them was during the Renaissance, as I'll show you here. Look, working in the same, this is the actual house, or one of the houses, of the Medici, where they run their banking industry out of the bottom. Look at the people that come out of this particular house in a 100-year period. Oftentimes, they basically are working right down the road from one another, or right down the hallway from another. Raphael, the birth of political science that shows up here with Machiavelli. We've got Ghiberti and Donatello. We've got Donatello and Michelangelo right down the hall from one another. There's Da Vinci's office. Galileo has an office later on. We have Lorenzo funding everything, and the patriarch of the family, Cosimo. Medici popes and Medici queens. No, during the Renaissance, there are 4 different Medicis that become the pope. Leo X and the 11th, Clement VII, and Pius the 4th. Medici queens, Catherine becomes the Queen of France. That's how important this family is. And Marie also becomes the Queen of France. And so talk about they're all living within about a 100-year window of one another in this cramped little space, which is really a palatial mansion, but in this tiny little space. So the question for you, can you name the explosion in the art and the content and science that showed up the next 2 times when we put the greatest minds all living in the greatest city or the greatest palace all together? Anyone know what those 2 times were? All right, perfect. One is ancient Greece. In a 100-year period, you had Pericles, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Polykleitos, Phidias, and Praxiteles, and that doesn't even include if Homer happens to be in that same 100-year window. And look, Greece is the beginning of Western civilization. The other one is New York at the end of World War II, or during World War II, where a lot of individuals flee from Europe. They all end up in New York City, creating New York City as the central hub of culture and economics today, with Marcel Duchamp and Einstein and Bohr and Fermi and Oppenheimer. So it's only happened 3 times in world history. It very seldom happens like this. So the last thing that I think that's the last thing for you guys today. I hope you had a wonderful kind of class and everything went well. I'm going to stop recording now. And have a wonderful day. Bye.